Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Paul D'Ambrosio. I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University. Today, the 四海为学 collaborative learning project is very happy to host Professor An-Ping White and her talk, Reappraising Ban Zhao, the Advent of Chinese Women Philosophers, or Reappraising, sorry. And we also want to thank Professor Erica Fox-Brindley for chairing the session and Professors Jana Rošker and Jing for providing comments. And I'd like to remind everyone that there will be an additional discussion section, mainly for graduate students, but professors are allowed, of course, to attend next week. And I'll put a link in the Zoom chat for anyone who's interested. The 四海为学 project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism and self-promoting. We also hope to curb some forms of aggressive and the kind of look, I'm smarter than you types of attitude that sometimes appear in academic exchanges. 四海为学 hopes to accomplish this change in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions and responses, and generally cooperative learning together. As many of us know all too well, miscommunication or missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. With the goal of fostering real, honest, humble exchange and open communication, 四海为学 encourages unselfish, anti-egoist, and the sort of don't be a jerk and let's actually try to learn together attitude. So here we have less of an emphasis on learning about Chinese philosophy, although we also include that, but we tried to focus a little bit more on learning from Chinese philosophy. And I think in general, Professor An-Ping White's work exemplifies this very well. So without further ado, I'll hand this talk over to Professor Erica Fox-Brindley. She is a professor of Asian Studies, History, and Philosophy at Penn State University. She studies the religions, cultures, and philosophies of early East Asia and publishes on a wide range of topics, including those related to the self and society, interactive knowledge systems, and cosmology and religious practice. So Erica, I'm handing things off to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me to be the moderator of this discussion. I'm very excited to introduce our main speaker today, Professor An-Ping White. She's professor of philosophy and also the director of Asian Studies at the University of Scranton here in Pennsylvania. She's also the executive director of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy. She earned her doctorate in philosophy from Marquette University. Her research interests include Chinese philosophy, medieval philosophy, comparative philosophy, ethics, philosophy of women, and social political philosophy. She's a member of several editorial boards of academic presses and journals, and she's authored more than 40 journal articles, book chapters, and book reviews, and has 3 published books. These books are just so you can look them up and perhaps after this talk and make sure you can use some of these as sources even. The Confucian 4 books for women. This one was a very big, important book published by Oxford University Press in 2018. She's also got the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Chinese Philosophy and Gender, and that's 2016, and Readings in Chinese Women's Philosophical and Feminist Thought from the late 13th to the early 21st century. And that's also with Bloomsbury, and that has recently come out in December of 2022. Also recently, she served as a guest editor and organizer of the special issue Philosophy, Women, and Gender in the New Millennium. And that was for the Journal of Chinese Philosophy. And she's also been a guest editor, an organizer for a forthcoming special issue that we can watch out for, Self and Other. And that's with NTU's, or National Taiwan University's, Philosophical Quarterly, coming out hopefully in March, maybe, of this year. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Peng White. And again, the title of the talk today is Reappraising Ban Zhao, the Advent of Chinese Women Philosophers.
Okay. Thank you, Erica, for a wonderful introduction. And I learned a lot from your work, your research as well. And I also want to thank Jana, Rošker, one of my role models as well, to be willing to take the time to be the commentator. And of course, Paul so graciously organized the event and invite me to be one of the speakers. First of all, I want to apologize to the audience. For some reason, I come up with asthma and bronchitis, sinus infection. So I'm not in my 100% brain power. So I'm operating with 50% energy here. And my hearing is a little bit blocked because of the congestion. But I will do my best. And I hope the PowerPoint is helpful here. Okay. So my talk is Reappraising Ban Zhao, the advent of Chinese women philosophers. Okay, as Erica already mentioned that I recently researched a lot of times is about the intersection of philosophy women and the Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism. Part of the reason is I used to do only medieval philosophy and ancient philosophy in the Western tradition. But just the past 5 to 10 years, I've become very interested in post-colonial and postmodern thinkers. And that really kind of gave me another fire to do the intersectional work between Chinese philosophy and feminism. So today's presentation is a continuation of that aspiration with 5 goals. One is to reread and reappropriate the canons responsibly and creatively. So here then, especially Confucian canons. And to second, that the many philosophical texts were written by male philosophers, especially in philosophy discipline. So I like, of course, including Confucian tradition as well. So I like to uncover neglected Chinese texts written by women. And then therefore then, at the same time, to provide a platform for more informed transnational decolonial feminist discourse that will include Chinese, specifically Confucian perspective in my work. Then doing so will broaden a feminist discourse, and at the same time to widen the conception of philosophy beyond the typical way we define it, such as by abstraction, by pure logic, argumentation, and so on, or analytical method. Those methods are important, but I feel they are narrow if we see them as the only way of philosophizing. So I like to introduce women's way of thinking by narrative, by storytelling, by emphasizing emotional bond with others, going beyond simply pure reason. Then one example of that is my book that is called by Oxford. It's called 女士书, 4 books for women. I run into this topic accidentally, just by reading other people's work and so on. I thought, wow, there are 4 books for women, and it's kind of astonishing to myself that I grew up in Taiwan, and we were educated to starting elementary school to study Confucian texts and so on, and I never heard about this set of books. Even when I finished college and so on, nobody ever mentioned it. So I think these are the kind of hidden texts that for whatever reason, we can of course say it's a part of the patriarchal structures that women also the texts were ignored. But then both men and women that we start in elementary school, whether it's a home education or school education, that we all heard about 4 books by Zhu Xi, the Intellects, the Mentions, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean. So that's part of the inspiration. And of course, it's one example for 5 goals I mentioned in previous slide, that how to widen the perspective of philosophy, not just in Western tradition, but in Chinese tradition, especially in Confucian tradition. So that's one example here. Then today's talk then, as I mentioned, that I like to especially focus on Ban Zhao. The 4 books of women, including 5 women authors actually, that also the 4 important works that were put together by a Ming scholar, Wang Xiang. He is the son of the Chess widow Wang, that is Wang Jiefu, and her maiden name is Liu Shi. So you can see that there is kind of a woman's heritage and the writing tradition in literary circles build on each other's work. So all these later books, they refer back to Ban Zhao's work, okay, but they also have their own new insights in their own work. And so there is a progression in this woman's literary tradition, philosophical tradition as well, because all these 4 works are didactic works talking about how one can become more moral, how do they cultivate the virtue, how do they become sage, etc. Okay, so today's work then, I want to especially focus on Ban Zhao, that in addition to her work, A Lesson for Women, I also want to tap into some other less known work, but more creative work by Ban Zhao. However, the resources is limited because a lot of women's work were not passed down or included in anthologies, and most of them, if not all, are compiled by male authors. So a lot of women authors' works were lost. Okay, so that's today's goal here. Then I like to give a little bit introduction about Ban Zhao, the person. Okay, that Ban Zhao is a member of a family of accomplished scholars, official during the Eastern Han Dynasty. Okay, that would be about 25 to 220 CE. And her family have several people very famous. Her father, Ban Biao, and the 2 brothers, older brothers, one is Ban Gu, the other is Ban Cao. And her father and her oldest brother, Ban Gu, both are very important historians. And Ban Cao, many of us grew up in Chinese cultural region, heard about his name because he is a great general. He was a great general in the Eastern Han Dynasty. Then there are movies made about him as well. Then also her great aunt, Ban Jieyu, was highly praised for her intelligence, virtue, talents, and so on. And there was one entry in Liu Xiang's biography of a woman, 列女传, about Ban Jieyu. So she came from a very learned family and so on, aristocratic family. The lucky thing she is in is her family actually, her father encouraged her to expand her learning, did not follow the traditional idea that a woman without talents is virtue. So she was very learned in that way. Okay, so Ban Zhao then was the first woman historian and woman philosopher, I will claim that, in ancient China, and very luckily, very fortunately, with written works passed down to the contemporary world today. That there are several reasons for that. Maybe later, if we have time, I can mention a little bit about why she's so fortunate. One of the resources that contributed to preserve at least two important work authored by her is the book of the later Han, Hou Han Shu, a dynastic history compiled by Fan Ye, describe her as Bo Xue Gao Cai, that is exceptional gifted polymath. And in this Hou Han Shu, in this historical book, the book of later Han, that is about Eastern Han Dynasty, that it preserved two works by her. One, of course, is a lesson for women that is famous, probably her most well-known book. And second is her official memorandum, a document that she wrote to Empress Dowager Deng. And so in that Hou Han Shu, we see two different kind of work authored by Ban Zhao. And because historical work is one of the major topics for Confucian scholars and so on. And that's one of the reasons that her work is very well known, because even male Confucians, they study history, historical work such as Hou Han Shu, they are aware of the work written by her. Then, of course, there are a couple other reasons that preserve her work, and her work become a primer lessons for women, for a woman's education in later dynasties. Okay. Then let's see a little bit more description about Ban Zhao from the Hou Han Shu. Okay, the Hou Han Shu also mentions that in addition to lessons for women and her official document to Empress Dowager Deng, to give advice to Empress Dowager Deng, is that she was also summoned by Empress He, Han Hedi, to complete the treatise on astronomy, 天文志, and the 8 tables, 八表, at the Imperial Library after her eldest brother Ban Gu died in prison. Okay, prematurely died, to finish the book of the Han, that also called the formal Han, that is Western Han, Han Shu. It's because of the political entanglement. Anyway, Ban Gu was put in prison and later on died in prison. And luckily, the rest of the family was not affected by that. Okay, so then Hou Han Shu also mentioned that Ma Zong, who is an assistant also in the later part of completion of the Han Shu, because Ban Gu died. So she was helped by Ma Rong to complete the rest, the later part of the Han Shu. So Ma Rong is from her county, so they kind of from the same hometown. And the others also study under her after Han Shu was completed, because it was very difficult to read. So they, these male scholars and so on, study under Ban Zhao to learn how to read the Han Shu. Then, because of Ban Zhao's talent and the virtue, that she was also summoned by Han Hedi, Empress He, to tutor royal consorts, and this was given the honorary title by the emperor as Da Gu. That is, that means that she's a great woman teacher. And after Empress He passed away, Empress Deng became the Empress Dowager and the regent of the state by default, because their son was very young. During this period, okay, these are all historical records from the Hou Han Shu. Ban Zhao participated in the state affair as an advisor to Empress Dowager. So These are interesting facts about Ban Zhao's life. You can see that her personal life is very unusual in ancient China. Okay, due to the enforced inner, outer, private, public, female, male distinction at that time. Okay, especially also in Eastern Han, the ritual code of these private, public, female, male distinction was especially enforced. Okay, because of the Han Confucianism and also some political incidents happened at that time. So they especially enforced the idea that the woman should not involve in political or state affairs. So this is very unusual. Normally, also, that the women were not supposed to study subjects other than domestic matters or politically engage in political role outside of the household. But you see that she was summoned to Imperial Library, both to after her brother died, and also as a tutor for the royal consorts, and then as a political advisor to Empress Dowager Deng. So these are very unusual situations. She kind of crossed the private, public, female, male boundary at that time. Okay, so that in this context, as rare a woman public intellectual, Ban Zhao clearly broke with the prescribed gender role at the time. However, she is an embodiment of contradictions. So in addition to her very unusual role as a woman, broke the traditional definition of how a woman should do, she was, so in that part, she's very innovative, very powerful in that way. But she was also a follower of conservative Han ritual codes. So for example, very young, at age 14, was a mother of several children and never remarried after becoming a young widow. Her husband passed away very early on. Okay, so she kind of followed the ritual code in that way. So I argue that her personal life and writing exhibited an interesting contradiction between her independent spirit as a contrarian, challenging the established norm, and in a way also conservative conformist compromise. She's also a compromise to the constrictive social norms. So it's studying her is very interesting, especially in thinking about feminist women's movement in the late 18th, 19th century and 20th century and now, like how she started very early on to negotiate the inner outer female male boundary, but not totally break out of the conventional norm. Okay. So then I want to call this as the problematic of Ban Zhao. Because of this, both as a contrarian and a conservative, as to be discussed shortly, I will talk more about that. Ban Zhao, though revered for generations, was a controversial figure in the past 100 years or so. Both praised an exemplary woman philosopher by scholars such as Robin. In Robin Wang's book, the images of a woman in Chinese thought and culture, in the entry about Ban Zhao, and condemned as accomplice to patriarchal oppression of women, for example, by the early 20th century anarchist female writer He Zhen. So she both loved and hated, to put it in that way. And what do I want to do in this presentation is like to resist the overly simplistic attempt to label Ban Zhao simply as an anti-feminist. I will situate her and her work in context and examine a wider range of her writings than is usually considered, including not only her lessons for women, but also her poetry and the memoranda, official document, to better position us to reappraise her philosophical stance and her distinctive strategy to gender politics more than 2 millennia ago, right? And the subversion of traditional gender norms. So I like to suggest we should read her work in the time historical context and appreciate her constrained but distinctive way of negotiating gender politics. Okay, so let's start with the most well-known work by her. Okay, among her writing, of course, her Lessons for Women, 女戒, also sometimes translated as Admonition for Daughters. And the second translation here, rather than Lessons for Women, Admonition for Daughters, is not a bad translation. It kind of takes into account her own preface, detailing why she wrote this work. Okay, she was writing this work not to be publicized as a primer for women's education. Rather, she was writing this work to give a marriage advice to her unmarried but at marriage age daughters. Okay, as you see, there is an original preface to this work by her, but there are 7 chapters that she offer marriage advice to her daughters. Okay, I later will argue that we need to read this work in context, because all these subject chapter title here can be offensive for our modern sensitivity. But I think we need to read more about why she wrote this and the political context at that time, which I will mention more. Okay, so it has 7 chapters intended. This is one of the first work around 100 CE, 4th century, intended for women's education and written by a woman. Okay, rather than male authors, men authors talking about how women should behave, give advice about women's proper behavior. I find it very interesting about this is giving us a glance about what the women want to say to other women about what's the way to cultivate the virtue. Okay, so there are 7 chapters in this. In Lessons for Women, then, I like to give our audience a few context here, insofar as yes, the text is conservative by today's standard. I will not say no. However, if we kind of go beyond the conservative nature of that work in the 1st century, during the Eastern Han Dynasty, very conservative political climate and cultural climate because of Dong Zhongshu's Han Confucianism and the political context at that time. Like, they are hidden gems, I will argue, for women to and for men to discover, like, what did she try to do and what she did do in this work, okay, conservative work. She still tried to argue that women should be treated with respect and they should be educated, even though the education is gendered education. Okay, but if we consider some education better than no education, it is still good in that way. Okay, so for example, chapter 2 of A Lesson for Women, the chapter on husband and wife, should emphasize the Tao of a husband and wife, 夫妻之道. Okay, so the way of a husband and wife, she argued, okay, harmonizes and matches yin and yang. It teaches spiritual beings and manifests the great principle of heaven and earth and the important morals of human relations. Hence, the record of ritual honors the essential relation between man and woman. The classical poetry makes known the Guanzhou poem. Based on this, clearly the husband-wife relation ought not to be taken lightly. Okay, this is the opening paragraph in chapter 2 here. And I like to note 2 things. One, the record of ritual, a lot of times was taken as oppressive to female gender, to women. There are indeed some ritual codes in this that kind of enhance the pressure on women, that compare women in the inner quarter, for example. However, if we read the broader context, other chapter, other passage in the ritual, in the book of ritual Li Ji, that you would also find it define men's role as well. For example, later on we're going to see that husband ought not abuse wife. Okay, spouses need to have mutual respect to each other. For example, women need to be educated at a young age as well. So there are certain things that the women actually in a biography of women, 列女传, many virtuous exemplar women use a record of ritual to defend their own decisions, or in today's contemporary term, their rights as women. Okay, so I think we need to take that into account, the whole work into account, not just isolated passages. Okay, then also the Guan Zhou poem about the water birds osprey. And these birds, they only have one wife and one husband throughout their lifetime. But we all know in ancient China, men can marry many women. One of the reasons is, of course, for offsprings, but also can be for their own sexual pleasure and so on, or satisfaction of empowerment. But the Guanzhou poem talk about spousal faithfulness, monogamy, right, one-to-one in that way. So it's interesting in this way when we observe the Tao between husband and wife. So faithfulness is the ideal. Okay. So then, as I mentioned about women's education, so in this passage, she gave a powerful argument about women should be educated, not keep ignorant in the inner quarter. So she argued, I find, okay, in this book, give a marriage advice to her young, not yet married daughters, that I find nowadays gentlemen scholars only know that the wives ought to be moderated by their husband, and the authority and dignity of a husband also, ought to properly be established. For this reason, they instruct their sons and teach them canonical classics. They hardly realize that husband ought to be served and the ritual propriety and righteousness ought to exist. Yet only to educate the man and not to educate the woman. Are they not being partial in the treatment of the two sides? Okay, according to the record of ritual, Li Ji, at the age of 8, children should begin receiving instructions on the classics. At the age of 15, they should receive adult education. Why is women's education alone not following this as a principle? Okay, here I use parentheses because it's a pronouns in the classic text, but according to context here, it refers to women's education. Okay, B. Okay, so that's one argument she made in defense of women. Okay, for women's cause here, and of course, education is important element for women's movement, feminist movement in the past 2 centuries or so. Okay, so another text in this conservative text, Lessons for Women, chapter 3, the title is Respect and Compliance. Okay, most people only focus on compliance, but neglect respect, this element in chapter 3. So I like to emphasize, in addition to compliance, that women need to comply to husband's will and so on. There is also the word respect here. That is more burden of husband as well. Okay, so let's see a quote here. She argued against domestic violence or physical beating by husband on wife. This happened a lot in ancient Chinese time. Okay, so if a wife, she wrote, does not moderate her affront to her husband, that is, she have bad words and so on, angry toward her husband and so on, scolding insult from the husband will ensue. If her husband's anger cannot be stopped, a whipping, a beating will surely follow. To be husband and wife relies on righteousness for harmonious intimacy, loving kindness for friendly union. If a beating is enforced, where is righteousness? If scolding and insulting words are spoken, where is loving kindness? When loving kindness and righteousness are both abandoned, deserted, husband and wife will part their ways, right? So here she's talking about mutual respect. That's the part of the Tao, the way between husband and wife that need to be emphasized as well, not just compliance of wife. Okay. Now, another text I thought is interesting, seems to support women's causes, even though it's more than 1,500 years ago. In this conservative book by Ban Zhao is in chapter 4. I'm sorry, let me drink some water. Is in chapter 4, women's conduct. Ban Zhao clarified the idea of 4 women conduct, 四行. Later on, was translated in slightly different wording as 四德. Okay, women's 4 virtues. But originally it was called 4 women's conduct in Ban Zhao's work. Okay, which first appeared in the record ritual and the Zhou rituals. Okay, in the record ritual, it did mention of 四德. Okay, so in order to dispel, okay, to remove that superficial interpretation that could trap a woman in self-pity if they misread the requirement, the 4 requirements here. So Ban Zhao in chapter 4 explained that. Okay, women have 4 areas of conduct. First, woman's virtue. Second, woman's speech. Third, woman's appearance. Fourth, woman's work. Speaking about these 4, woman's virtue requires neither unparalleled talent nor exceeding brilliance. Woman's speech requires neither rhetorical eloquence nor sharp words. Woman's appearance requires neither a beautiful nor a splendid look or form. Woman's work demands no unsurpassed skills. Exhibit tranquility, safeguard integrity. This is what they mean by woman's virtue. Choose words carefully in speaking. Never utter slanderous words. This is what is meant by woman's speech. Keeping one's clothing and accessories always fresh and clean, bath regularly, and keep one's body from filth and disgrace. This is what is meant by woman's bearing, that is woman's appearance. Concentrating on weaving and spinning, prepare wine and food neatly and orderly to offer to the guests. This is what is meant by woman's work. These 4 areas are matters of great integrity for women. No woman should lack them. Yet to do them is quite easy. The key is to always keep them in mind. Confucius had a saying. The Triniac is the sage. Okay, Confucius had a saying. Okay, but we know this is Confucius' saying, right? Is humanity really so far away? If I desire humanity will surely come. This is what it means here. Okay, I find this is very interesting passages here. One, okay, at the end of this paragraph, she especially bring forth the paramount Confucian virtue Zen, humanis, into discussion. And to say if I desire humanis, humanis will surely come as a conclusion of a woman's full conduct, full virtues here, okay? But we know in the analects, in the mentions, in many other Confucian canons, a lot of times then, or Confucian humanists was talking about 君子, more exemplary, literally, it will mean man, right? Gentleman. To talk about woman's virtue. So this hint and suggests she did not say humanist Confucian Zen is a gendered excellence, only applied to one gender, for example, men or males. But it is a virtue women can cultivate. And the second point I want to mention is, even in everyday mundane task, okay, but if you do it right, let your mind with the right motivation, the mind has a right mindset, okay, you do it with integrity, you do it with virtuous intent, and so on, that itself is a practice of humanism. Okay, for women, even your needlework. Okay, there's one point I'm going to mention later. That is, she did use women's needlework to illustrate conscientious public servant. Okay, so you can see that this is a very important for women's causes and so on, especially when women are misread this, think about women's appearance, it means unsurpassed beauty, or focus on how pleasing physically you have to your male counterpart. That she's talking about woman's appearance means being clean. It does not mean you have to be super beautiful, focus on your external appearance, but rather the beauty comes from in. You need to focus on your inner cultivation, your virtue. So I think this passage is very, very important. All right. So therefore I argue that yes, indeed, her work, Lessons for Women, as some will claim, are conservative. But I also want to argue that we need to think about the context of this work, that it was composed more than 1,800, 900 years ago, almost 2 millennia ago. Also, at the time, her bodily physical condition when she wrote that. Okay, so she was in her 50s and she was very ill. So she is not sure. In her preface, she mentioned she did not know whether she can survive this illness. And she was worried about her daughter's well-being because they are at the marriage age, but she did not feel they are properly trained about the way, the doubt between husband and wife. So she was writing those 7 chapters to give them advice. And as you can see, she came from an aristocratic family. They are very close to the royal family, right? In their privilege and so on. They are further away from the ordinary common folks and so on. So because of that closeness to royal family, there is also added burden and anxiety and fear there. Because easily you say one thing uncareful or do something a little bit lack of prudence, you could only get yourself killed, you could get your whole family clan killed, or even 9 family clan killed if it's a serious crime, and so on, if you provoke the anger of the emperor. Right, so she had to be very careful in giving advice to her daughters about how to survive in such a political setting climate, in a very conservative Eastern Han political setting and cultural setting. And very possibly her daughters were married into members of feudal lords or other high officials, or even to a prince, right? So she had to be very careful to teach them how to safeguard their woman's integrity and not to ruffle the feathers, okay, so they can be happy, okay? And at the same time, to educate, to teach her daughters, they had to focus on their own self-cultivation, had to focus on education, not to remain ignorant, etc. And then I add one more text here, right? even though she did say that men can marry multiple wives, but according to the classic text and so on, but woman can only marry one husband. Okay, very conservative advice there. But she also says something, make her advice here very different from Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his work, a French writer, in his work, Emile. Okay, Emile's advice to women is to always do things pleasing to men and so on, including sexual lure, physical attraction and so on, right? And the art of cunning, and so on. But you see then Ban Zhao, even in talking about women's role is inferior to men's role, according to the classic teaching. There is a symmetrical relationship there between two genders. She also talked about women and that the wives need to uphold their moral integrity. So you see here, okay, she said, a wife must seek to win her husband's heart. Okay, nonetheless, there is a qualification. To seek a husband's heart is not to rely on flattery and charm, physical charm and so on, in a demeaning way in order to gain his affection. Okay, you see this direct contradictory to Rousseau's advice in the Emile. Okay, such behavior is not as good. Okay, that is flattery, deception, or flirting, physical charm, and so on. Not as good as if she is one-minded with a solemn appearance, focus on her virtue, uphold her woman and wifely integrity. Okay, now we are going to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, she has Ban Zhao both exhibit a contrarian spirit, but at the same time, also like a conformist and so on. Okay, so we'll see He Zhen's charge. Okay, in addition to many other people, but He Zhen's charge is probably most damaging. That is, He Zhen, early 20th century Chinese feminist and also an anarchist, that charge her in this way, right? She said, by the time we come to the Eastern Han period, we encounter the case of Ban Zhao. The teachings she promoted are particularly absurd. She opened her admonition for daughters, that is lesson for women, by championing loneliness and weakness. She also opines that if a woman fails to serve her husband, moral principles will falter, that weakness is a woman's merit, in spite of being a woman herself. Ban the traitor was seduced by the seditious teaching of a Confucian tradition, and she hacked at her own kind and brought shame onto womanhood in its entirety. In being a slave of a man, she was an arch-traitress, okay, super traitor, ultra traitor to women. Ban the traitor actually said that it is proper for women to remarry, but a man must by no means serve to, a woman by no means serve to men. I truly did not expect these words to have come from a woman's mouth, even less the fact that they should be eulogized in the ages that ensued. That the rights and powers of a woman fail to develop can be attributed to the fact that women are well versed in Ban the Traitor's book. Okay, so this is a serious charge about Ban Zhao's writing and her philosophy and her book about education of women. And as I mentioned, I want to introduce one, to consider Ban Zhao's lesson woman in its context, and two, also introduce more adventurous work, even more daring work by Ban Zhao that are not well known. Okay, so now I'm going to move to that. And I notice my time here, so I'm going to rush a little bit, okay? One is her famous, very long poem. It's a Han style poem. It's very long, okay, almost telling a story and so on. Is her Dongzheng Fu Rhapsody on a journey to the East. The occasion for this work is she was moving to area that is more than 200 miles away from the capital city, away from her home, that they already lived there for a long time, to a new city. So she's sad. She wrote this poem about how sad she is thinking about the move and be away from the old home to a new place that they will know a strange place, no one. So she was sad. So she wrote a long poem to express her sadness. But then immediately she changed her mood when she think about their responsibility, official duty to the people of the country and to the emperors and so on. So she lifted up her spirit, think about, and that is a public spirit. So she changed her mood, and then she then begin to see the environment, the journey as a way to learn further about how to see nature as encouragement of more exemplariness, and how to see the ruins of historical site as a way to commemorate past sages, at the same time to encourage yourself to become equally morally exemplary, right? So here then is very okay, sorry. So we'll see some lines from here. Okay, she said, then I lift up, right? I let my eyes open and my spirit warm. Then when enter the outer city wall at the Guang's bureau's old side, it made me reminisce about the distant past, recalling Confucius suffered hardship here during a time of decline and chaos, abandoned, and even the sages was threatened and in danger. When we arrive at the border of Cengyuan, let observe residents living in the field, staring at the ruin of Pucheng, that Zilu's brave spirit came to my mind. The people of Wei lauded his courage and righteousness. Even today, they will pay tribute to him. Qu Yuan was buried in the southeast part of this town long ago. Yet people still come to show their reverence at his grave. Only great virtue is immortal. Even after death, the good name endures. Know that our endowed nature, okay, both male and female, right? Endowed nature rests in heaven. It relies on our own diligence to be near humanity. Okay, so she commemorates the past sages, but take the occasion of this long journey as a way to encourage each other to cultivate the virtue, to become more exemplary. Okay, then, as I mentioned earlier, that she also used women's needlework. Okay, as I mentioned earlier in the full womanly conduct, women's needlework as occasions that you can, if you see the essence of it, to the spirit of it, as a practice of virtue as well. So she used a needle and thread to as analogy to talk about conscientious public male servants like Junzi. She said, welded from the hardest essence of the metal, its shape, needle, is small and subtle, pointing and straight. Its nature is to penetrate everywhere, yet it advances slowly with one single thread. It reaches myriad things. Only the traces of needle and thread are indeed far-reaching, broad, and without a fixed origin. It rejects the corrupt and repairs the mistakes, like a lamp with whitest fleece. It is not what a bamboo basket with small capacity can measure up to. Even if their merits are engraved on stone and taken into the hall. This is referring to the imperial hall, okay? So she's using women's work, the small tools, needle and thread, as a metaphor of conscientious public servants, okay, with more exemplariness. Just like a woman's work, they might not be visible always with the grand duels that some corrupt official will have. Because corrupt official metaphor here is like a bamboo basket with a small capacity. They look big externally, but they really have little virtue or talents, right? Even if their merits were engraved on the stone and taken into the hall, it's not true virtue. It does not matter. Okay, the metaphor is coming from the intellect in book 13 here. Okay, so and I also want to mention that her official petition for replacement for her elder brother Zhao here. Okay, because of time, I cannot read through all the contents here, so I will just make a comment on the content of this petition. Okay, her brother Ban Zhao has been stationed in the western border for 30 years to protect the country, to ward off invaders and so on. So at this time, he is 70 years old. And as you can see that he went through many hardships here. And a lot of his companions, other soldiers and so on, already died and so on, right? But his oldest, he was still not like come home. And Ban Zhao wrote the petition for her brother to the emperor. And that is another thing, kind of like a state affair, that you interfere with the state decision to keep your brother at the Boston western border, even though he's very old, his teeth fell out, there's not one teeth in, there's not one black hair, his eyes are blurry, can't see well, he cannot walk without a cane, he's hearing impaired and so on. But he petitioned 3 times, but his petition was not granted to let him come home, right? So Ban Zhao was, as you see, he's risking his life to beg the emperor, please let Ban Zhao to return home. She made several argumentative points with strategic maneuvers there, right? So one, she appealed to the emperor's sympathy that my brother has worked for the country for over 3 decades, 30 years, in a very difficult physical environment in the western border, full of deserts and so on, right? And now he's so old. Shouldn't a humane king let this royal servant, the old horse, old steed, to come home? Then secondly, she appealed to national security. You let the old general guard the western border, isn't that to put the country in danger, right? So she appealed to national security. And she knew the emperor He knows highly about her. So she said, I risk my life to beg you for mercy, okay? Then she appealed to sage kings in the past. For example, King Wen, Zhou Wenwang, at the Satra, and Tian Zifang, and so on. The sages or sage king, what they do to take care of the elders servant who has served the country so much, or they die for the country. And then she also then cited virtuous women in the past to argue that if something really happened and the country got attacked because the old general who physically incapable to protect the country, but you station there, if something really happened, please forget Zhao's family, not to kill the family blame, right? Claim. So she then said, I'm foolish and ignorant, not understanding the great principle of state affair. I have violated your highness taboos because women are not supposed to interfere with their decisions. Please forgive me. So you see that it's a pattern of her plea in the official document, okay? And that's typical in ancient Chinese document to say how foolish you are, how ignorant you are, and then beg for emperor's mercy and forgiveness. but at the same time to give the political advice or admonition. Okay, so you can see she's hardly a slave or man when she risks her life to stand up to a male emperor and to give a contrary opinion, and implicitly to say, emperor, you make the wrong decision here. So I feel that this petition show a good case to manifest that she is not actually a woman in the sense to break the gender boundaries, private, public divide, and show courage as a woman to go against, provide opinion against her male superior. She here will be the emperor, right? In addition to that, she has another memorial to Emperor Dowager Deng. At that time, Deng, as Emperor Dowager, Deng Taihou was the regent of the state. So too, like the Emperor, Empress Dowager Deng asked her for her advice, like about whether she should let her Emperor Dowager's brother, that was a grand general, guarding the state, to let him retire, that because their mother passed away, and the Empress Dowager at the first was declined that request to retire because she need her brother to be in court as a grand general for the state military power to keep the balance of political power. So she asked Ban Zhao to give advice about her opinion. So Ban Zhao mentioned, citing the importance of honorably and humbly yielding your position to others who are more capable as the greatest virtue of all. I have heard that humble yielding is the greatest virtue of all, to give advice to the empress, and citing the past virtuous sages as well, how they yield a kingdom to another person. So with her advice, then she convinced the majesty that the Emperor Dowager Deng to grant her Dowager Deng's brother to retire, the grand general to retire. And then again, she mentioned about how ignorant she is, but you see that there is a kind of strategic negotiating over the boundary here. Okay, I have two more slides here. Then that will be it. I'm sorry to take up more time here. Okay, one thing I do want to mention, in addition to Ban Zhao's bravery to provide counter opinion to Emperor He and Empress Dowager Deng, right? I also want to mention her contribution, her writing. I think in many ways, Ban Zhao negotiated more space for women's development, and including unexplored space, in addition to being a public actor, right? She's kind of like a public intellectual, a public actor. In addition to that, she created a new genre for women. Okay, in other words, then, especially writing by women for women in didactic texts to give women advice instruction about how to cultivate the virtue. This kind of opened a door for many other women, for example, the Confucian books for women, to take her example as a beacon, as example what they can do. I think that is very important in that way. Even though she did not do competitively the best job, what today's feminists would argue, but we need to take the context into account, right? So I think her writing exemplify what Helene Sixou, a French writer, in her The Life of Medusa, she's also a postmodern feminist. She argued, right? Women must write herself, must write about a woman and bring women to writing from which they have been driven away as violently as their body, from their body. Woman must put herself into the text as into the word and history by her own movement, okay? Not to strengthen their own narcissism or verify the solidity weakness of the master, but make the love better to invent, okay? Then I also want to conclude this presentation with Derrida's quotation from one of his easier essay here, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. I see Ban Zhao's writing and his philosophy as an example of what Derrida is saying here, okay? Here, there is a sort of question, call it historical, of which we are only glimpsing today. The conception, the formation, the gestation, the labor. I employ these words, I admit, with a glance toward the business of childbearing, but also with a glance toward those who, in a company from which I do not exclude myself, turn their eyes away in the face of the as yet unnameable, which is proclaiming itself and which can do so, as is necessary whenever a birth is in the offing. Only under the species of the non-species, in the formless, mute, infant, and the terrifying form of monstrosity, end quote. So to conclude, I like to argue that, yes, Ban Zhao is a contradiction, okay? However, it also here lies her great. She did not solve the gender problem, okay, the asymmetry relationship between man and woman, but she exposed the problems and she tried to negotiate the new space for women, even though she did not do completely successfully. But that's a writing of a new history, waking in of a new, right? So even though we cannot really name it, we don't know how to place her. She may look monstrous to He Zhen or other certain feminists. But I like to argue, she's doing something new, the as yet unnameable, under the species of a non-species, in the formless, mute infant, and the maybe terrifying form of monstrosity. But given her context, she is a woman pioneer in this way. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I take up more time here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peng White. That was a very, very interesting coverage and expose and analysis of Ban Zhao's writings and life and her concerns at the time. And it opens us up to so many different questions. At this point, we have about 20 more minutes to discuss things. I'm going to turn it over. I first want to ask, is Jing in the audience? Because we're still looking for you. If I don't hear a response, then what I think we can do is move on to Professor Rošker and our discussant for today, and have her give a 5-minute kind of response and open things up for further discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce Professor Jana Rošker. She's Professor of Sinology at the Department of Asian Studies, Faculty of Arts at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. She teaches the history of Chinese philosophy and the methodology of transcultural research, and her research interests include Chinese and comparative philosophy, Chinese epistemology, logic, Chinese logic, transcultural philosophical methodology, and much more. Professor Rošker, if you could take it away here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika, for your kind introduction. And thank you for your intriguing lecture, Professor Peng White. I have really learned a lot by your exposition of some very unknown or less studied texts, which have now completed my previous knowledge on He Zhen. And I would like to thank you especially that you have delivered this intriguing lecture in spite of the fact that you are unwell or you are not feeling so well. So if you will think that my questions are somehow displaced or uninteresting, you can also ignore them. But I must say that this lecture was also a part of your work that I have been following for a long time, because I think it's very important. You have made an incredibly valuable contribution to the pioneering work of gender studies in classical Chinese philosophy. So your work on the Nu Sishu, for instance, and your analysis of the work created by female Confucian philosophers such as the Sister Song or the Empress Wen or Xu, and so on, is indeed very precious. And it will doubtless become a classics of feminist studies in Chinese philosophy in future. I'm convinced of that. And for me personally, it is particularly significant regarding one of my own central endeavors, namely to expose the importance of classical and ancient sources for contemporary people. So in this regard, I think that Ban Zhao is, regardless of her apparent conservatism, a figure of utmost relevance for the contemporary feminist movement or the contemporary feminist discourses. So although the Nu Jie is, of course, the most conservative, as you said in many of your works, the most conservative of the Nu Sishu, but still it includes some contributions to the feminist philosophy. So in my view, Lessons for Women was certainly one of the first works, if not the first work in Chinese history, which explicitly advocated the literacy and education of women. If we evaluate this fact by considering the social and ideological context in which this book was written, it quickly becomes clear that it included very progressive and perhaps even radical and revolutionary ideas. Since one of the main Confucian classics, the Book of Rights, Li Ji, openly states that only male children should be educated. So it is precisely this radicalism of her argument, which advocates women's literacy, that is something fundamentally different from the otherwise conservative lessons, I think. So this discrepancy has always caused problems for intellectuals and researchers of the Chinese past, seeking to construct a coherent interpretation of the intentions that actually led Ban Zhao to write this guidebook. And in this light, it becomes also clear that Ban Zhao's fight for the education for women had a large influence on later generation in China. So her work is also important for another reason, namely, because it helped to eliminate the patriarchal prejudice, as you showed very clearly in your lecture, of the apparent contradiction between female talent and female virtue. Because those qualities were defined in the Nu Jie, Lessons for Women, as complementary and as positive. So we can see from your lecture that far from being silent, Chinese female scholars like Ban Zhao have often engaged in shaping Chinese intellectual history from ancient times until today. So in this context, I was thinking about whether you could maybe elaborate on the following question. Namely, how can the lessons from the Nu Jie and the struggles of these women be relevant to modern audiences? Or more concretely, what is, in your view, the greatest triumph of Ban Zhao regarding the female gender? How can the reading of her texts contribute to the feminist movement on the global level? And then I have a second question. You can also choose to reply only to one of them. My second question is linked to a broader view of gender studies in traditional China. I am aware that you're primarily a specialist in Confucianism, but in contrast to the official Confucian doctrine, which propagated a strict patriarchal and social hierarchy, Taoism based itself on incomparably more egalitarian assumptions. So the equality of men and women is also one of the more notable peculiarities of Taoist religion. So Taoist practice and theories offered women a key to spiritual transcendence and independent decision-making over their fate. So women in Taoism have had completely the same opportunities for education as men, in contrast to Confucianism. So in Taoism, women could even also become enlightened masters. So my question in this context is, how would you contextualize such works, especially those written by female Taoist philosophers like Sun Bu-er or Wei Hua-Cun in the broader scope of the Chinese classics? And more importantly, do you think there is a way to connect such discourses with your feminist reading of Ban Zhao or even of the New Sishu? So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jana. I enjoy your work so much. Again, you are inspiration for many women today by all the work you do, and then also the journal you are editing. That's tremendous work, I know, because
thank you.
Just two special issues, I had a headache. So anyway, thank you. And thank you for your comments here. If I understand you right, there are two questions you have here. So I will answer the first one first. That is about Ban Zhao's, what kind of contribution Ban Zhao can make toward global feminism or feminist discourse globally. I think that a lot of times in Asian region or other non-Western regions, when we talk about feminism, feminist movement or women's movement, a lot of times immediately what we are thinking about is the authors or philosophers, the movers from the West. Okay. And my thought is that transnational and global feminism, if we take that as pretty similar, they have been criticized in the past decade or so as being somewhat ethnocentric, that did not take into the voice of other women from other cultures or other philosophical tradition into account. And so I feel, in addition to complain about that, like they complain about that, whether, you know, Chinese-looking people or Western females, authors, they like to diversify the global feminist discourse here. I think it's important to translate other works by women from other non-Western world into English, because a lot of time the lack of knowledge, or you want to say it in a more provocative term, ignorance here, is because there's a lack of a primary resource. So I think I translated the New Shishu, including Ban Zhao's work, is with that in mind. How can we provide more first-hand source, a primary text that can make Western readers that cannot read Chinese, especially classic Chinese, that they are able to have, they can have access to these writings. And I hope that provide a platform that we can become more learned about this intercultural conversation discourse here. So I think Ban Zhao's work now is translated. And I gave not only translation, but also commentaries from the one of the commentators, etc. So we see the historical changes there. And I hope we see now we can tease out some of the content in Ban Zhao's work to see, wow, some of the contents are so modern, actually, right? Even more progressive than the Enlightenment thinker, such as Rousseau, about what the woman's role is and so on. Because some people want to say Ban Zhao's view about women lowly, men highly, a woman should devote to one man, kind of similar to Rousseau's view, which I want to argue is not, if you look at it in depth. So that's one thing I will answer. Second question about Taoist contribution and Taoist female sage or enlightened person, such as Sun Bu-er. Yes, I totally agree. For that matter, I want to argue Buddhism as well, right? Taoism, Buddhism, and so on. I want to say that in their philosophy, a built-in structure, that in Taoism and Buddhism, because of relativity of opposite or the anatomy, non-self, anatomy, these ideas allow more kind of fluid conception about the nature of a man or woman that is non-essentialist. Allow that, right? But Confucianism, I argue, therefore then Taoism, Buddhism has a lot to teach Confucianism. So they can serve as a counterweight to Confucianism's more conservative ritual, codified view about women's essence and so on. So I think there is a lot to that. And then we need to do more about that. But I feel that for Chinese cultural region, Confucianism is so influential. It's like an ideology in Confucian society. So I want to debunk that first. I want to do that part first to see what we can do within Confucianism. So for example, Han Confucianism kind of misinterpret, rigidify the yin-yang concept that was more loose in the classic of I Ching, correct? The book of changes. And Dong Zhongshu kind of rigidified it, and then that become the way we follow today. So that's why I focus more on Confucianism. But I'm very interested in Taoism and in fact, my mother, in her old age, decided to become a Buddhist nun. So she is a nun now. So I have innate interest in Buddhism as well. Okay, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, yes, you did. Thank you, and thank you for providing some new food of thought. Of course, it is clear that Confucianism is much more influential than Taoism, if you take the Chinese culture and society as a whole. And what I also think is very important in this regard, and what you again exposed, is that we have to make people, readers, more aware of this distinction between original Confucianism or Confucian philosophy on the one hand, and political Confucianism or the Confucian state doctrine on the other. I think this is also very important.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I would love to read them so that Professor Peng White can respond to those. Please just put them in the chat. In the meantime, Professor Peng White, I was interested in just hearing what, along the lines of, translating Confucianism into this kind of postmodern idiom. How would you suggest that, a so-called a philosophy that relies so heavily on ritual and, playing your proper role and fitting in, how can you destroy the patriarchy? We don't want to go back to the Han. Clearly, Ban Zhao was in a very different situation, and I loved how you pointed out how she was brave in certain ways that we might not appreciate today. But how would you propose, not even thinking about Han constraints, just Confucianism and what it offers in terms of ritual hierarchy? I mean, there's a lot that can be said for that, but it also can constrain in terms of a patriarchal, patrilineal society. So I was wondering if you have a kind of postmodern response or some kind of interpretation of how we can move on. And how could a Confucian woman in today's society still be a Confucian and translate that into not a non-patriarchal kind of structure?
Okay. Thank you so much. This is an excellent question. I don't think I totally work it out, but I will try. I think the postmodernism, such as Derrida and so on, they especially talk about the symbolic order, right? And so why the symbolic order? that could include, for example, ritual code in a society, and to set up the distinction, the sharp contract or dualistic scale between the normal and the abnormal, right? So in that way, I see that the Confucian code, when it was rigidified, then it tried to do the same thing, right? To set up a symbolic order. And there is a very hierarchical, rigidified way of one way of doing things. That's the correct way, okay? However, I want to argue that feminists or women who are interested, maybe they don't want to call themselves feminists. They just want to call themselves as a woman for gender equity, for example, or womanists, they may say that, and so on. That I think there are ways to read it even in Confucianism. I think you cannot just read the Book of Rights as the highest authoritative Confucian text, right? You need to read it with the Book of Jing, the Book of Changes, and so on. Even in Li Ji, the Book of Rights, it talks about flexibility of a ritual code. So for example, I would take one example. For elderly who is sick and so on, even when they see high officials in a higher rank than them, they don't have to bow or prostrate on the ground. Okay, another example will be, I just want to show the flexibility there. That is, if a son who is observing funeral rites for deceased parents, that's a huge ritual requirement. Like they are not supposed to eat meat, etc. Okay, but the Book of Rights also said, if this person, the son, is ill with a physical fragile condition, then he definitely should eat meat, violating the ritual code, and so on. So I want to emphasize one, the Book of Ritual itself allow a spectrum of practices there, not necessarily rigidified reading of how ritual code is. It's not one point, but spectrum. Second, I think there are counterweights in Confucian canons, such as the Book of Changes, I Jing, or even the Book of Poetry. Some poems there that can use as a counterweight to correct Confucian, like one strict view about the symbolic order. Second, we'll go back to what Jana said earlier. That is, Taoist philosophy and Buddhist philosophy certainly should be used as resources to revise Confucianism.
Thank you. We have one question, and I think that will be our last because we're actually out of time. Guo Zhongwei, I see your question here. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Pang. And I'm a student from the City University of Hong Kong. Actually, I'm doing the research very similar with you right now. I just read all of the new Sishu recently, and I found that their contexts are really similar. So especially they illustrate the relationship between the females' parents-in-law, the relationship with their husbands, the relationship with their family, and so on. So to some extent, Nu Sishu, all of these four books are very similar. So my question is, what's the biggest distinction among the Nu Sishu? So I mean, the flow of Nu Sishu are very quite similar. So the biggest differences of this are, what is it? And the second questions are very similar with Professor Jana. I think, what's your attitude towards Ban Zhao's writing and modern feminism? Because I noticed that you have made the comparison with Sishu and Nu Sishu. And from my perspective, Sishu represents the patriarchal structure, and Nu Sishu represents the female structure. So you did make the comparison between them. So these two are my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. If I understand your question correctly, are you saying that the flow of the 4 books in 女士书 are similar?
Yes,
Okay,
the
okay.
contents. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there is some similarity, but there are also big differences there. Okay. I try to do that in my book. Also from the general introduction itself and an individual introduction to each of the 4 books to highlight the difference between the 4 books in the 女士书. Okay, so I think there is a big difference here. For example, that if you look closer, like the Ban Zhao's lesson for women, 女戒, only focus on marriage between husband and wife. Okay, so just one role of the many social roles. But then when you move to the analects for women, 女论语, you will see that the 2 Song sisters, they don't just talk about spousal relation, the role between husband and wife. They try to talk about multiple things. For example, your relationship with your parents as a daughter, your relationship with your in-laws as a daughter-in-law, your relationship with your neighbors, in addition to relationship with husband, right? With neighbors, with your sister, brother-in-law, etc. And woman's economic responsibility to the family. Okay, so 女论语 then is more written for the common folks because it talk about how a wife need to raise pigs and chickens. They had to work in the field, etc. So I would say 女戒 lessons for women by Ban Zhao is more for aristocratic woman, high class. Okay, and then the classic Chinese is also harder in the 女戒. 女论语 is so easy to read, even classic Chinese, because it was done on purpose for the more common folks and so on. Okay, then the third will be Empress Ren Xiaowen's book that will be 内训. That is also for aristocratic family, right? Because the empress wrote it to educate royal consorts, women in the court, in the royal court. And the classic Chinese is harder too. And she cites tons of different classic texts and so on. And that is the only work in the 女士书 got included in scholarly section in the 四库全书. That is 子部. That's hard. Very few women got included in that. 子部, a lot of times male Confucian scholars and so on, okay? But Empress Ren Xiaowen's work included in 四库全书 is 子部. And then also that one, she then go beyond family matters. She talk about political affair because as an empress, as a wife, royal consort to state lords and so on, you have to give advice to your husband about political matters and so on, even though in a private space, not necessarily in the court or in public realm, but you have to know political affairs. So I think there is a progression there. Last one, by Wang Jiefu. She's not coming from the elite class, and one interesting thing is she's from the South. The previous 3 women also are from the North, and she's from the South, Jiangling. So I think it represents a Southern woman's view, and she's also not from elite class. And but her son, raised by her, she's a widow too, was very learned, but it does not have a lot of record on, you can look for it. So probably not a high ranking official either. There's very little record about her son. Okay, he compiled the 4 books. And that book, I will argue, is the boldest of the 4 books. Okay, just because of time, I just mentioned one case here. That she included not just a regular woman we regarded by tradition, by society as a virtuous woman, she included like courtesans, prostitutes. That imagine Confucian society, prostitutes, okay? Like these are the kind of women usually shunned by society, including female monastics and so on, right? Like Ninggu nuns and so on. So I feel like the last book there is the most outspoken in multiple ways by inclusion of examples that are atypical. Okay, women usually not even considered by Confucian society. Two, she's so outspoken mentioning in many matters, men's thinking are inferior to women's thinking, especially for emergencies, like things not happening according to patterns. Like you cannot just follow the ritual code or typical political template. That would be sudden situation. She want to argue women are better to handle sudden emergencies and so on. So that's my reply to that. Last point is the difference between 世书 and 女世书. They share some similarity in the sense that the 世书 are like standard textbook studied by a male Confucian scholars for civil examination, right, to become officials and so on. 女世书 similar in that case that they are almost like a must-read primers for women's education in that case. But of course, women cannot take a civil service examination. That's not the same. But they share similarity as didactic texts for women's learning. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question and also for the discussion, our discussant with Professor Rošker, and for our main speaker today, Professor An Pang White. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and feel free to email people if you have more questions. And I will just, I guess we can just say goodbye at this point. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jana. Thank you, whoever asked the question. And thank you, Erica. Thank you so much, everybody.
It was nice to meet
Thank
you.
you,
Thank
Paul.
you for the great talk.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, no, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Bye.